My name is Mauricio Maldonado. I'm from the state of Campeche in Mexico. It's a beautiful place, though often underestimated from my perspective. This story takes place specifically in a small town called Chicbul, near Ciudad del Carmen. The experience is not mine but my father's. He is a truck driver and his job takes him on constant travels, which meant I saw very little of him during my childhood. In those days, when I was just a year and a half old, my mom and I also traveled frequently between our town and the state capital due to her obligations. One night while my mom and I were away, my dad stayed alone in our small palm house, which was our home at the time. The house was very modest but cozy. Among our few belongings, we had a small decorative statue. A typical Mexican asleep with a zarape and a large hat covering his face. You know how we're depicted in cartoons. That night, my dad was resting in his hammock trying to regain strength before his next trip. However, he suddenly felt a strong tug on the hammock that woke him up abruptly. And as you can imagine, although puzzled, he decided to ignore it, attributing it to fatigue. From where he was, he could see the statue in the corner of the room. Completely normal. He turned in the hammock, trying to ignore what had happened, but minutes later, heard something that made his blood run cold. Soft footsteps crossed the room. They reminded him of the ones I took in the afternoon when I played in the house. "Romana?" he called, thinking my mom had returned with us. "Ma," he called me. But silence was his only response. Turning in the hammock, he realized he was completely alone. The glass door showed the dark early morning, and the statue remained in its place. However, he noticed something unsettling about it, as if it was slightly shifted. Annoyed, he got up. He took the statue and left it outside the house near the door. From inside he could see it through the opaque glass. Still exhausted, he fell back asleep almost immediately. But it didn't take long for him to wake up again. This time due to soft knocks on the door. "I'm coming," he murmured sleepily. He looked at his phone. A small Nokia that, although not very modern, at least allowed him to see the time, 3:56 in the morning. Sitting up in the hammock, he turned toward the door. What he saw left him incredulous. The statue was no longer there. For a moment he thought someone had stolen it. Annoyed, he jumped up and went outside to look for it. He looked around, but the thing was no longer there. Then heard a noise. A sound behind him. A soft giggle, almost childlike but strangely high-pitched. Shoo. Feeling a twinge of fear, he quickly returned inside the house and what he saw left him frozen. The statue was behind his hammock, as if waiting for him, in the same posture it had before. With a mix of courage and anger, my dad grabbed the statue, shouted all kinds of curses at it, and threw it out of the house again. More angry than scared, he returned to lie down. However, fear began to creep in little by little, even though he tried to hide it behind his temper. Shortly after, the knocking on the door started again. This time my dad slowly sat up in the hammock, but what he saw left him paralyzed with terror. In front of the door, that thing was no longer just a statue. It seemed to be alive, twisting and deforming, as if trying to take the shape of a small person. The figure wobbled. Every movement was unnatural, as if its limbs didn't work quite right. At that moment my dad couldn't take it anymore. He curled up in his hammock, covering himself with the blanket while praying desperately. His thoughts turned to me, to my mom and me, begging for it all to end soon, for him to see us again. Eventually, between prayers and exhaustion, he finally fell asleep again. It was the sound of the door opening that woke him. My mom and I had arrived home. My dad jumped up and hugged us, especially me, with a mix of relief and fear he had never shown before. He immediately told my mom everything, who was as surprised as he was. She had never seen that statue in a strange way, and it never entered the house again. Currently, my parents are separated, which makes opportunities to see my dad very difficult and things very limited. However, the last time I visited him in the village, we reminisced about this story together. The time when a simple funny statue became something more. Something my dad says resembled a goblin. Something we could never and will never be able to understand. As a final note, sometime later we moved to the capital of Campeche. When transporting our things, that statue, which we did pack with us, disappeared without a trace. My parents never knew what happened to it or how it got lost. All we know is that night, something terrifying was in our home.